everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to have a few people presenting, so I'm going to give you just a brief intro so you know who's going to be talking. We have Surin, who is our business development manager. He will be one of the presenters. Also, Ben from DivergeIT, and he is our sales engineer. And then last but not least, we have John, who is our cyber liability insurance expert from DataStream, who will be here explaining things for us. We will have a Q&A section at the end of the presentation. So if you do have any questions, please drop them in the chat, or there's actually a Q&A section. I will be keeping track of all of the questions so that we can get them answered towards the end. If you do have an immediate question, there is a feature that kind of lets you raise a hand. Feel free to raise a hand, and then you can drop your questions in chat if there's something that you wanted us to explain again or go deeper into. We're more than happy to answer any of your questions. So with that, I will hand it off to our presenters.
Great to chat with everybody. I'm glad to see everybody hopping in. Today's discussion, we're really going to dive into the cyber insurance side of things, right? Hopefully answer some of your questions. Ideally, a lot of those questions will be answered throughout the presentation itself. That's really what this presentation is all about. But just like Vicky said, if anything comes up, don't hesitate to drop it right in the chat or raise your hand, whatever works best for you for reaching out. But let's dive right in. Let's start talking a bit about cyber insurance. And the way I like to start that is by talking around the need and why it's really arisen, probably why a lot of you guys are even on this call in the first place. Is because you're starting to hear more and more about this thing called cyber insurance. And it's really grown into a need recently because of the attacks that have increased on the SMB space, right? Specifically, really since the pandemic was a big fast forward button, but since then we've seen a huge increase. And to this year, these numbers are from actually this last year that just passed. 68% of small businesses had some sort of cyber attack, with the average cost, and this is the average cost I always like to point out, for employees under or companies with under 500 employees, almost hitting that $3 million mark. So it's not a huge surprise, that almost a quarter of those businesses that were hit end up actually having to file for bankruptcy. And there's a couple of reasons that SMBs are being targeted, but the biggest one and the most unanimous one across the board is going to be data, right? Pretty much everybody has some sort of data nowadays. If you're doing business in any sense on the cyber world, you've got some sort of data typically out there, right? Whether it's going to be PII, that personal identifiable information for, either employees or customers, financial records, accounts, health records are another big one, right? All of these are things that can be stolen and ransomed, right? Those are going to be the ransom attacks that you hear about. A lot of these folks going out and stealing that data, holding it for ransom, right? Number two, of course, not being able to be down for any length of time, right? Some businesses are, supposed to be up and running pretty much 24/7. And so if that happens to be, you, obviously going down in any sense of the term can mean damage to your reputation, obviously loss of income, all of that good stuff. And the last one, obviously, is one kind of across the board for any business, no matter how big you are. You have some sort of money that can be stolen, right? Maybe not be as big of a focus for the SMB space as maybe the enterprise space, but it's still, you'll still hear about these phishing attacks and these bad actors going after even, $10, $20,000 kind of cyber crime, as we often refer to it now. So those are going to be the main reasons. And unfortunately, even with this growth in attacks, we're still not seeing necessarily the adoption. And that's why we're seeing the increase in attacks and really a shift in the focus from the enterprise space to the SMB space, right? It's almost easier for these bad actors to just go around checking loose doorknobs and seeing who's unlocked versus setting up this huge intricate plan to go after this enterprise. It's a lot easier for them to just kind of send out a lot of phishing emails and see who answers the door, right? But a couple of numbers here that obviously make us worried. 58% of folks thinking that they're unlikely to be targeted by some sort of cyber crime, when we just We know that's just not the case, right? It truly is about when, not about if nowadays, right? You might not be big enough to make the news, but you're definitely not too small to get hit by a cyber attack. Is how I often like to phrase that, right? So we know that this risk exists, right? And we've maybe even had a bit of a fast forward button on it. I always like to tell folks, we were always heading in this direction, right? Where more tools were going to be needed as we had more and more business done, in the cyber world. Naturally, it means more bad actors also are going to exist in the cyber world. So we were always heading in this direction, but we really had a bit of a fast forward button pushed on it. And so we're here now. So how do we tackle this, right? We're an SMB living in a world, in the cyber world, where suddenly we're in the need to take our cybersecurity seriously. How do we tackle this? Well, it's really a two-step approach, and it's the same approach that we take for any of the other risks that we deal with in life, any of the other big ones. My favorite metaphor is the fire risk, right? That we all, a lot of us have to deal with if we own a house or maybe own a business with a brick and mortar store. Is we have all the tools and technologies to help mitigate that fire, right? The smoke alarms and the sprinklers and the detectors, but that is balanced by the collective resources, your fire department, your fire insurance, right? These things are meant to be a balance because one really can't exist without the other. You can't just have insurance because you need those tools to mitigate the everyday potential attacks. The insurance is there for the catastrophes, right? You don't call the fire department for just a small little maybe potential fire. You call them for the real catastrophes, right? So it's the same exact approach for cyber insurance, right? You're going to ultimately invest in your own resources, reduce your own risk with those tools, and then invest in the collective resources, right? So reducing that risk looks like investing in your own cybersecurity program, right? Getting those basic controls in place. And I'm going to let DivergeIT talk a bit about that in the next slide here, but really setting yourself up with a layered approach to cybersecurity. A big, very popular word in the insurance space is going to be redundancy, right? And that's the same idea, is setting yourself a layered up or redundancies inside your cybersecurity approach. And a big one right there at the end I always like to hammer on is having some sort of incident response plan in place, right? Having an idea of what you're going to do, what are those first steps going to look like when an incident actually does occur, and also testing that, right? Making sure that that thing actually works for you in the case of an incident. But yeah, want to pass a little bit to Diverge to talk a little bit about some of those basics in terms of the controls that really you should have in place when we were looking at getting your cybersecurity house in order.
Sure. So I do want to mention that the title of this slide is the basic cybersecurity controls. So there's even more advanced than this, but at least this is the initial steps you want to take to make sure that you begin becoming secure. So properly configured firewall. This is your first line of defense to actually have a firewall for those that have a corporate office. And an example I like to use is if you're running a harbor. You would want to make sure that you're only letting boats come into the ports that you want to come in. So if you just have all the ports open, someone's going to come ashore and you're like, you don't have a shipment scheduled for today. So just making sure that you have a firewall there configured, that's your first line of defense. Multi-factor authentication, everyone probably has experienced it a little bit if they don't have it currently in place. But if you're logging into, let's say, your bank account and they send you a text to log in, this is one of the most simple things to implement, but often most overlooked to have it organization wide. So actually by policy, you can't get in unless you have a multi-factor authentication. It's really great because right now I could hand out my email and my password to someone and say, go ahead, try to log in. And even with my password, they would not be able to log in because I would need an authenticator app or a text message with a code in order for me to get into my corporate environment. So that really is a simple but really effective way to stop the bad actors from logging in. Endpoint detection and response, just especially in a bring your own device environment after COVID, a lot of hybrid work environments, being able to see things that are happening on an end user's device if there's any threats existing there. Vulnerability management. This is really an ongoing process to make sure that you are plugging all the holes in the boat. So if you could imagine a boat with a bunch of holes on the ocean, you want to take a look at the big one first as opposed to just plugging the little ones. Being able to report on that, making sure that you did patch up all the holes, and then over time taking a look at, oh, this hole's eroding a little bit, we need to update that patch a little bit. Just having an ongoing process in place. Spam filters for emails, making sure that you can stop those even before they get into your organization. Security awareness training, that's also a very big one. So in 2023, we're almost in 2024 now. The way someone is going to be getting in is through people. Though you can configure your firewall, doesn't really matter if someone gets an email, clicks on a link, and logs in on a bad page. So it's really making sure that people have that awareness of what they need to be and what they need to not be clicking. And then offsite backups. Every day I probably talk to someone that has a backup of, let's say they have a server locally and they're backing it up on the same server locally, or they're plugging in a hard drive right into the same server and it's just right there. You really need to have a plan in place that if something happens, that you have a backup somewhere that you can get right back in, especially in a ransomware attack. You don't want to be held hostage. You want to tell them, actually, I got a backup. I'm all set. Thanks very much. So, and again, these are just the basics. So it can get more advanced than this. But if you have these 7 steps in place, that really sets up your security posture for protecting yourself.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that we kind of have a slide like this is because these are also the basics, guys, that the insurance carriers are really going to be looking for too. And I'll touch on that a little bit deeper and some of the specific guys as well later. But yeah, I always like to mention that yeah, these are really some of the real basics that these insurance companies are also really going to want you to have in place as well. But so we've talked about yeah, we've talked about those technologies that you can put in place, getting your cybersecurity house in order. And again, those are just that's really locking the door, right? That's what that is, right? Making sure your door is locked. You got all your doors locked and loaded. You can always take it steps further, but at least we have taken care of locking the house down. Now, after that, for any of that cyber risk, I always like to use the example or metaphor similar to fire that it's basically impossible to get anything fully 100% fireproof, right? You can't necessarily, it would be extremely expensive to go around fireproofing your entire house, as an example, right? Coating everything in fireproof material and all of that. And that's exactly why insurance was created, right? Because getting to 100% quote unquote protection is virtually impossible, if not extremely, extremely expensive to do so, right? So you get as close as you can to that with those tools and technologies, and then transfer the rest of the risk. And that's exactly why insurance was created back in the day. And once again, it's no different for cyber insurance, right? So you get as close as you can with your tools and technologies, and then you transfer the rest of that risk to a cyber insurance company. So we've talked about why, but what does it actually cover? What is a cyber insurance going to protect you from in the case of an actual incident? And a good, strong cyber policy, and I'll touch on what that looks like as well, but a good standalone cyber policy is going to be incredibly broad, and it's going to include coverages in these 3 main areas. So data breach and response, right? That's going to include all the legal side of the data breach, the first party liability, any of the damage done to you directly, any of those bricking costs, the IT forensic, all that fun stuff, right? The business interruption side of things is going to be any of that cost of downtime, right? So that's going to be your revenues, salaries, all of those things that you need to pay for in order to get your business back up and running, right? The cost of getting you back up and running. And then the extortion side of things is the ransomware, right? Some of you might know it better as ransomware. So that's going to include paying those ransoms themselves, as well as any of the legal side of things, IT experts. Another one that's not on here, it's actually become more of a talking point recently, is cyber crime. That's also going to be another coverage under a cyber policy and has become more and more popular as these phishing attacks have grown and grown in the last few years. But that cyber crime is going to incorporate, fraudulent transfer, right? So if somebody sends a pretend email to one of your customers, right, and says, "Oh, we've changed our bank," or so suddenly your customers are sending invoices to the wrong people. That's an example of cybercrime and is absolutely covered in a cyber policy there. Now, so we know what's covered. Now, what are going to be the current requirements in order to qualify for one of those decent policies that is going to be a standalone policy? Because that's one of the other differences I always like to explain on these types of webinars as well is you may think you have a decent policy, but in terms of coverage, you really want to look for a standalone policy that's going to be about $1 million in coverage versus what's often a warranty or a add-on or a rider on top of your general liability policy. And those guys might not have these requirements in order to obtain them, but they are often incredibly lacking in the coverage themselves. So you're always paying for it somewhere. So if you're in a policy that doesn't necessarily have these requirements, I would be nervous to look at the actual language in the coverage, or maybe the premiums or deductibles are really high. You can even see here, for example, MFA, we are able to show some percentages when we're comparing those carriers that don't actually require MFA, typically are about 8 to 10 percent more expensive than those that do. You can see a lot of the, for example, offsite cloud backup is actually going to be a pretty much universal requirement at this point across all of the carriers. Without it, you're virtually not going to be able to actually find an insurance policy. Nobody will give you any quotes. And then as you move down into EDR and security awareness training, this is really going to be very specific also for as you get larger and larger, you really want to make sure that you're staying in line with your peers, making sure that you're getting these tools in place as you're growing as a company. Because without these things in place, the carriers really deem your actions online and in the cyber world as uninsurable, right? They actually view you as an uninsurable client, and they won't touch you typically with even a 10-foot pole. So that's what the policies actually look like, a bit of the differences there, what you want to look for in a good policy. I often recommend at least $1 million even as a starting point. That goes back to that average cost that we saw being around the 3 million point. But that gives you an idea of what the ideal policy looks like, what you really want to think about when you're getting a policy, and of course those technologies that you really should have in place, right? Really those basics that you should have in place ideally before even applying for a policy. Now, I always like to mention how to set yourselves up for success with a policy, and that's how to ensure your claim is not denied. It actually really feeds into what we were just talking about, which is those technology requirements, right? A lot of folks can get into hot water because you go through that initial application and you're just checking the box on those technologies that they're asking about, saying, "Oh yeah, I got MFA, I got offsite cloud backups, I think I got ADR," right? You're just kind of rolling through it, and then, of course, comes time of the claim, the carriers are going to do their due diligence and they're going to actually look into it and say, okay, you said you had MFA in place, prove it. And so, one of the things I encourage is not only ensuring that you answered those things correctly, right, at the time of applying, but proactively making sure that you're staying on top of it, right? You said you had MFA in place. Last thing you want is to have a carrier come in and say, well, you did have MFA in place when you applied, but over the time it seems like, you lost like 50% of your MFA users, and one of those users was the one that this attack happened to find their way through, right? And suddenly they're able to find a way to not pay out that claim. That's a big stigma that I often hear from folks right now is, isn't doesn't cyber insurance, not pay out claims, right? They're really picky. And they will absolutely do their due diligence, right? If you said that you had MFA in place, they want to know that you had MFA in place, right? Because they're taking on that risk with the understanding that you're doing these tools or you're doing the right things, right? Having these tools in place. So when folks come to me and they say, "Oh, you know, don't most of these guys not pay out?" It's typically one of two things, right? Somebody checked a lot of these boxes at the time of applying, and it ends up being that they didn't have them in place, or it's one of those other things that I mentioned, either a warranty or one of these riders or add-ons on top of their general liability, right? Those are a little bit wonky, and we are very nervous about their language. They're typically very limited in their language. They're typically, 15, 20 pages long versus a standalone 70, 100 page cyber insurance document. So leaves a lot less wiggle room for the carriers to sneak out of. So those are the two ways that people get their, or really the two avenues that stigma around insurance, cyber specifically insurance claims being denied a lot. It's typically always they answered the application a little too aggressively, and they weren't doing those things, or what they thought was a standalone cyber policy, in fact, was a warranty or a rider on top of their general, which are both very limited in their coverage. Um, but that talks a bit about the cyber insurance, and now I want to make sure to kind of pass the ball back to Surin at Diverge, to really dive into how you guys, as in the SMB world, should navigate this landscape going forward.
Great. Thank you, John. So, as John mentioned there, there's two components here, right? It's managing or mitigating the risk and then transferring that remaining risk. Where we help businesses is to help mitigate this risk. And here are, some of the things that we, when we're discussing. I mean, first and foremost, I'm sure, for several or most of you, we've given you enough to be concerned about during this webinar. But now it's kind of what are the next steps? Like, how do you approach this? The first question that we ask is, when's the last time that you had a third-party assessment conducted for your business, for your IT, for your controls, your security? And I talk about third-party, and I'm going to emphasize third-party. Even with our clients, we actually recommend that they go get a third-party assessment. Now, why is that? I have kids, 13 and 15. If I ask my son, I call him right now and say, "Hey, is your room clean?" Guess what they're going to tell me? They're going to tell me that room is clean. I need some third-party validation for the fact that, is your room clean or not? And that's kind of the same thing here. A lot of you might have internal IT teams or an external IT resource. If you ask them to prove it to you. This shouldn't be, these are things and everything that we demand, or, what I'm recommending here. These are tools and things that we can provide real time. So it can be done, not 2 or 3 days from now, because again, if my son says, yeah, come back in 2 or 3 days, I know that room wasn't clean, right? So a few things as far as real-time reports, a checklist. And as John mentioned, you've seen this reiterated a few times. So from the insurance side, it translates exactly to how we approach it on the IT management side as far as our clients go. But do you have MFA by policy? Now, here's the key word here, by policy, because if you ask your internal teams or your external teams, they're going to say, yes, we've got MFA in place. I checked off a box somewhere, but it's by policy. And the example here, I'm picking on my kids, but try to limit them with with Apple with downtime, screen time. I forgot what they call it. But my kids figured out a way to circumnavigate it. And one extra minute. Are your employees doing that? Are they bypassing the MFA policy like that? Well, if you have the right policies in place, it will allow them to, it will be required. And that's what we mean by enforced within the organization. Cloud or offsite backups. The word backups oftentimes, like a lot of these words, gets misconstrued. This is not about the ability to recover, an Excel file or a Word document. This is in the case of a breach. If you were breached, do you have the means to recover and restore business within a very quick, reasonable amount of time? Now, so you may think, yeah, okay, again, your team's telling you that we have cloud or offsite backups, but are you testing it regularly? And, one of the things that, again, going back to the analogies, not picking on my kids this time, but you've got a backup car. Think about the horror movies, right? They're getting chased down by the bad guy. They go jump into that old car and they're trying to get away. But lo and behold, that truck, it doesn't start. Is your backup system like that truck? Has it been tested? So when you need it most and you need to fire it up, is it going to be there and working for you to restore business? Antivirus and patching, you want to, it should be a process for this. I'd say that's the key word. It's not about, our IT resource got around to it. 30 days from now, or when it's convenient because they're fighting all these other fires? Is there an automated process for antivirus and patching? Because I assure you, the bad guys are not waiting for you to patch and and download antivirus in order to plan their attacks. So making sure that there's a process for this and having it automated as much as possible. User accounts, active, inactive. Clearly, all of you are hiring folks, so you're onboarding. On the flip side, you're also offboarding. All these user accounts, they're like, I'm always comparing it to securing a house, right? So you got open windows, doors. So if you're in the, you're in the living room of a very big house, and somebody's like, hey, so which windows are open and which doors are locked? And, are you able to do that? Are you able to do that? Because if there's open windows, if there's open doors or unlocked doors, it's very easy for the for intruders or the bad folks to get in. So having a third party, or just having a third party, a reporting system that can do that, that is highly recommended. What you're seeing here is what we call RAD. Yes, it worked out to a nice acronym, but Rapid Analysis and Discovery. What you're seeing with these screens here, this is actually proprietary here at DivergeIT. Undoubtedly, your teams have access to this data, but I will say it with certainty that the ability to extract this information and compile it in a very meaningful, telling way, like a dashboard like this, is probably slim. This is what rapid analysis and discovery is kind of a sliver of our larger system. We call it RITIS, real time IT intelligence system. And what we do, this is actually an assessment that we do for folks. It's a user report. So inactive, active users, like I'd mentioned in the previous. Again, you're going to see a lot of these themes recurring here, right? But this is what we benchmark here, because a lot of you might be thinking, where do we stand here? This allows you to benchmark and get an idea of where you stand with everything. Multi-factor authentication report. Again, where does it stand as far as, is it enforced by policy? We can take a look at that. Breached account report, Ben had alluded to before. I assure you, many of the email addresses that of the folks that are on this webinar are compromised, but having MFA in place, it protects you against that. But we'll let you know what that looks like. And then from an environment standpoint, secure score, 365 health check, licensing review, very key here. From a licensing standpoint, a lot of folks have licensing that is underutilized, and underutilized from a security standpoint, that ties directly into what we've been talking about here today. Not only that, also from a cost savings. So it's, that's where expertise comes into play here. And then from an email security standpoint, we take a look at phishing policies and a few other items. So that being said, we typically, the RAD assessment starts at $1,000. Typically, what we'd like to do is offer that to folks. So if you're curious to know where you stand, this is a very quick turnaround with our engagement, 24 to 48 hours, and we'll have the results and a report that we present to you and let you know where your business stands. So if you reach out to us before September 8th, we'd be happy to engage with you on that. Now I'll open it up to questions and happy to respond to questions that you guys might have.
While those are potentially coming in, I'll figure I'll answer a question that sometimes I hear a lot in regards to especially the work from home situation. So with COVID, not everybody always going back into the office and having a hybrid work situation. Wondering if these different types of controls and things in order to qualify for the cyber insurance, do those change? Does it change now that everybody's not in the office and now we're at home and that kind of thing? Not really. It might be slightly modified. So for example, you would only have to worry about cloud backups as opposed to like, oh, my local server, I have to have that backed up. We don't have one of those. But you don't want to rely on Microsoft or let's say Dropbox and just have them do the backup, because we have seen it firsthand where somebody's Dropbox backup doesn't actually work. So making sure you have these controls in place, but they might, be slightly modified. So if you're strictly using, let's say, web apps or just working from home, still the users, still the devices are points of vulnerability. So you do want to have those controls in check.
And I actually have a question that came in from an email separately regarding, I think it was web applications. Yes, it says we only use web applications for our law firm. Would our requirements be any different?
Sure. Not that much. You definitely would want to still have MFA to log into those applications. And there's ways that an IT services provider could help you with that process. So they have something called single sign-on, which would reduce the number of times you have to log into different applications. So let's say you have to log into your Microsoft account to check your Outlook. Then you'll have to log into your legal web application with a different set of credentials. And all of those could potentially be potholes for somebody either getting in, or when you're logging in with the credentials, if somebody sends you a link, you click on that page, it looks like your legal platform, but it's actually a website over here that someone made it to look exactly the same. You're logging in there and providing credentials in the wrong spot. So with single sign-on, it's nice. You can use Microsoft, let's say, as your identity provider, and you can just keep passing along those credentials through your different web applications. So with that in place, that would really help shore up the MFA. But as far as we're just using web apps, you still will want to have certain controls in place to make sure that you do qualify and stay qualified for that insurance. And I know it's definitely a lot of the information that was presented today. It's a lot of information. It's a lot to take in. So having a trusted IT services provider to give you a roadmap and a timeline and how to actually achieve those things will definitely help. And sometimes too, depending on the type of small to medium sized business, you may or may not have different compliance standards that you would need to meet. So though you're not a Home Depot, billion-dollar company, you may have to meet, let's say, HIPAA requirements or PCI for financial transactions. So an IT services provider could also help you to meet those compliance and just kind of take you on that journey to make sure that you can shore up your security to meet those compliance standards. Basically, to have someone to help you along the way. You don't have to know how to do all this stuff. Rely on someone to do it for you.
Yeah, I think it brings up a good point on the insurance side of things too, that I wanted to mention a bit earlier, and often get questioned about it too, because there's a lot of ambiguousness, and that's exactly why we created DataStream in the first place. We strictly handle, we stay in our swim lane of cyber insurance because we saw this kind of incredible tumultuous market, right? So for everybody out there that doesn't already know, cyber insurance right now is completely unstandardized. So every single carrier you go to is going to be slightly different from the next carrier that you go to. It's one of the reasons that we set ourselves up as a brokerage and work with pretty much right now the entire cyber market. It's about 40 plus carriers to make sure that we can go out there, because yeah, I mean, every carrier actually handles every customer a little bit differently, and some carriers are even a little more focused on certain industries than others. So it's one of the common questions we get is, why would I necessarily work with an expert in cyber insurance versus just going to my local broker to get my cyber insurance, who we love. We absolutely love the local brokers. But one of the big reasons that is because typically that local broker is only working with one, maybe two carriers at most. And oftentimes those are the bigger carriers. And those bigger carriers right now aren't really the ones focused on cyber insurance. They make all their money on the general, the fire, all that stuff. So they're not really typically the experts in the cyber insurance side of things. And one of the reasons you really want to just get out there and apply at as many insurance with as many insurance carriers as possible, so that you can really get as many options back. You can go through those options and pick what's going to work best for your or for yourself as a company and your personal risk and your needs. And that's what we're here to help you do, right? Is really to go out there. We have a universal application, right? Number one, so you're not having to fill out multiple applications for multiple carriers, but with one universal application, we go out there, shop it amongst, make sure you're getting the as many quotes back so that you can choose what's going to work best for you. But yeah, it was a great point that I meant to bring up earlier, because there's just a lot of confusion right now around the cyber insurance space and what's the difference between all the carriers and all that good stuff. And so yeah, highly encourage working with an expert like us to kind of navigate the market right now.
Now, one of the things that comes up, from my standpoint as well, is a lot of folks are, well, do I apply for insurance before I kind of know where we stand, or do I get an assessment? John, you may have, kind of different thoughts. Absolutely, you should have a cyber insurance policy in place. I would say get that process started if you haven't. And even if you have it, you should always be assessing, benchmarking, and knowing where you're at, because number one, having the right tools, protocols. It's not about just getting that policy, but your premiums will be lowered as well. Correct, John? As far as so you're going to have more affordable. Your risk goes down. The insurance company looks favorably upon that because you're lower risk. So that's where either an external resource like DivergeIT or internal, but you want to make sure that you're benchmarking, because you may get that application, and I think we mentioned it in there, but there was a word proactive. Are you proactively managing these controls as you go? Because it's cyber insurance is a lot different than than maybe life insurance, where it's very easy to check those boxes and kind of know where you stand. Are you a smoker? Where your kind of risk factor is. A lot of the stuff, it's not static, it's fluid. Things are changing. Multi-factor maybe at a certain level at one point, but then it's new administrator comes on, changes policies, and it changes. So it's about continuous reporting, benchmarking, knowing where you stand, because it's not where you were when you got that policy. It's about do you remain there as 6 months down the road, 12 months down the road, and so on.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, right? And the last thing you want at the end, come that claim arise, is really any sort of questionability about, did you have these things in place, right? It's a much smoother claims process if you got all those recordings right, you got it all recorded. Yep, easy to pass all that information off to the carriers and say, nope, we got everything in place. Here's all the proof. We got all the documentation and all that stuff. It just makes it a much easier process. You can imagine trying to find all this stuff in the middle of an incident, right? Ideally, you want to set yourselves up for success for an incident, right? And so that you can bounce back as fast as possible.
I think that might be it with the questions. Again, if you are interested in in cyber insurance in a policy, by all means reach out to John, and he will point you in the right direction. If you have if you're interested in taking us up on the offer for RAD, the Rapid Analysis and Discovery, my contact information is there on the left, Seren. Feel free to give me a call or email, and I'd be happy to help you. Thank you so much for joining us today.